I never thought my own family would leave me to die. But the morning I woke up alone in that forest, with all their things gone and a note telling me to keep walking, I knew nothing about my life would ever be the same. It took me 2 days to crawl back to my house, and when I finally stepped through that door, I decided they would never call this place home again. Before I tell you my story, please make sure to like and subscribe to support the channel. Also, let me know how your day is going and where you're from. Thanks! My name is Evelyn Carter, and the morning I opened my eyes to find my family gone started like any other, except that nothing would ever be normal again after that. I sat up on the thin camping mat, feeling the stiff ache in my hip from sleeping on the uneven ground, and I looked around, expecting to see Frank rustling through the cooler, or Lisa pouring cereal into a plastic bowl for Maya. But the campsite was stripped almost bare, like somebody had run through, grabbing everything in a rush. The fire pit was cold, the tent I'd shared with Frank flattened into a heap, and all our backpacks were missing. My heart kicked hard, and I called out, "Lisa? Frank?" But there was no answer, not even a stirring in the trees. I thought maybe they'd gone to the trailhead parking lot to get something, but my phone was dead, and when I walked over to where we'd parked the SUV, there was nothing but tire tracks in the dirt. My throat went dry. I glanced back to the fire pit and saw a folded piece of paper weighed down by a rock, so I picked it up, hoping for some explanation. All it said, in Lisa's handwriting, was, "Keep walking." That was it. No, "we'll be back," no instructions, just those 2 words that made my skin go cold. I set the note down and tried to focus on what to do next, telling myself there had to be some rational reason, maybe an emergency I didn't know about, but then I noticed something that made the air seem thinner around me. A few feet away, under a scraggly bush, was Frank's faded blue baseball cap, the one he wore every day, and the front of it was smeared with something dark that I prayed wasn't blood. My first thought was that he'd gotten hurt and they'd gone to get help, but that didn't explain why they'd take the car and leave me with nothing. My hands started shaking. I looked around again and tried to spot any movement. Nothing. I picked up the cap and pressed it to my chest, thinking about how just last night he'd kissed my forehead before we all turned in. My voice sounded strange in the emptiness when I called out their names again. No reply. I crouched down to pick through the flattened tent, hoping maybe they'd left a flashlight or water, but the pockets were empty. My mouth felt like cotton. I knew I couldn't just stand there. I forced myself to think clearly. We'd been here 2 nights, and the trail we'd hiked yesterday looped around a ridge about 3 miles west. If they'd gone that way, I might find signs of them. So I stuffed the note in my jacket pocket and started walking, counting each step to keep my mind from spinning out. Every few yards I stopped to look back, still hoping they'd appear, maybe laughing about some stupid prank. But each time, the campsite just looked more deserted. About 10 minutes into the walk, I noticed the ground had been disturbed. Twigs snapped. Patches of dry leaves scuffed aside in a line that almost looked deliberate, like somebody was marking a path. I followed the trail, and as I went, I tried to replay our last conversations. Lisa had been distant for weeks, barely speaking to me except when she had to. Frank had tried to smooth things over, but even he'd been on edge lately, saying we needed this trip to clear the air. I never guessed clearing the air might mean abandoning me. The trail led past a cluster of boulders, where Maya and I had sat yesterday, eating peanut butter sandwiches. I felt a lump in my throat thinking about her pink plastic lunchbox with the stickers she was so proud of. I hoped to God she was safe. My legs were already tired, but I kept moving because standing still felt worse. A little farther along, I spotted something tangled in the low branches. A corner of the baby blanket Maya still slept with when she thought no one was watching. It had been wedged there as if on purpose, like somebody wanted me to see it. I touched it, and it was damp with dew. But no blood, no sign of struggle. That should have reassured me, but it didn't. I stuffed the blanket into my pocket and kept walking, thinking about how Lisa used to call me every day when Maya was born, how she'd once said she couldn't imagine raising her without my help. Now she couldn't even leave me a proper explanation. My thoughts kept spiraling into darker questions. What if this was punishment for something? What if they blamed me for things I hadn't even realized I'd done? A wave of dizziness hit, and I sat on a flat rock, rubbing my temples, trying not to cry. I needed to conserve my energy. I dug around in my jacket, hoping I'd left a protein bar in one of the pockets, but there was nothing. That was when I realized how deliberate this felt, how nothing had been left behind. My family knew I had trouble walking long distances, that my phone barely held a charge. They'd taken everything I'd need to make it back easily. A fresh panic rose in my chest, but I swallowed it down. I wasn't going to fall apart out here. I stood up, forced myself to keep moving. About an hour later, the trail turned, and that's when I saw something that stopped me cold. Propped against a fallen log was Maya's little blue backpack, the one with her initials stitched on the front. I rushed over and unzipped it, hoping for food or a note. Instead, there was a small pile of my things. My reading glasses, the old gold locket Frank had given me for our anniversary, a roll of medical tape I always carried in my purse. Someone had gone through my stuff. My chest tightened with anger and confusion. I didn't understand why they'd do this, why they'd make it look like they'd vanished, but still leave pieces of themselves for me to find. My hands were trembling so hard I nearly dropped the backpack. I was about to turn back when I heard something. Just a whisper, soft enough I thought I'd imagined it. I held my breath. It came again, drifting from somewhere ahead. "You shouldn't have come back." My heart slammed against my ribs. I froze, straining to see if there was anyone there, but the trail beyond the log was empty. My mouth went dry, and I took a slow step backward, clutching the backpack to my chest. Part of me wanted to scream for help, but some instinct told me whoever had spoken wasn't trying to help me. I swallowed hard and forced my legs to keep moving. Every time I glanced behind me, I imagined a figure standing there in the brush, watching. My pulse hammered so loud I thought it would drown out any other sound. I didn't know where the rest of the trail led, but standing still was worse than whatever I might find ahead. I tightened my grip on the backpack and whispered Maya's name like a prayer as I started forward again, feeling like I'd just stepped into a story I never agreed to be part of. I didn't let myself stop walking after I heard that whisper, because standing still felt like surrendering to something I didn't understand. So I clutched Maya's backpack tight against my chest and moved along the trail, even though every step made my legs feel heavier. My mouth was so dry it hurt, but I didn't have water, so I forced myself to swallow and focus on each footfall, thinking about all the small ways my life had felt fragile lately. Like, maybe I should have seen something coming. Frank had been distracted for months, always stepping outside to take calls he wouldn't explain, and Lisa barely looked at me anymore, like she was carrying around a secret she couldn't wait to drop at my feet. Even Maya had been quieter, glancing between the adults like she knew more than she should. I kept replaying our last meal around the fire, Lisa pushing beans around on her plate while Frank stared at the ground. And when I asked if everyone was all right, nobody answered me. I tried to believe this was all some misunderstanding or accident, but the longer I walked, the more it felt like they'd been planning this. My knees were starting to ache, and I had to rest for a minute, so I sat on a flat piece of ground and opened Maya's backpack again, thinking maybe I'd missed something useful. Inside, wedged between my reading glasses and the locket, was one of Lisa's hair ties, and for some reason, that small thing made my chest feel like it was caving in. It was ordinary, familiar, proof that she'd touched this bag herself, that she'd thought about what to leave me. I tried to imagine what was in her head when she did it. Was she crying? Was she angry? Was she relieved to be rid of me? My hand was shaking as I zipped it up and stood again, telling myself that no matter what they'd done, I wasn't going to let it end here. I kept walking, my mind darting between memories of better times, Lisa calling me in the middle of the night when Maya had a fever, Frank making me coffee every morning, and the hollow dread that maybe all of that had been wearing thin long before I noticed. After what felt like hours, I reached a place where the trail widened, and I saw something off to the side that didn't belong there. A plastic bag with a torn label, sitting on top of a flattened cardboard box. I moved closer, half expecting another note, but when I picked it up, I realized it was a bag of trail mix, about half full. My stomach cramped with hunger just seeing it, so I opened it and ate a handful, trying not to think about how it got there. I knew someone wanted me to keep going. that each object was like a breadcrumb pulling me deeper. But I didn't see any other choice. When I stood up to keep walking, my legs were trembling, but I forced them to move. A little farther on, the path split in two directions, and I had no idea which way to go. So I looked for any sign, broken branches, footprints, something. On the left, I noticed a strip of blue cloth caught on a low branch, the same color as the shirt Frank had been wearing. I felt a twist in my gut, but I followed it because the idea of choosing wrong made my head spin. My mind was starting to play tricks on me, making me think I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I turned, there was nothing. I kept moving, because if I stopped, I knew the fear would win. I was almost too tired to care anymore when I saw movement up ahead. A man crouched near a fallen log, rummaging in a large canvas bag. My first instinct was to call out, but something made me hesitate. He looked up suddenly, and I realized he was holding a camera with a long lens. He was dressed in neutral colors, clothes that looked like they belonged to someone who spent most days outdoors, and he had a short beard and lines around his eyes like he squinted a lot. When he saw me, he didn't look surprised, just wary. I stepped closer, trying to keep my voice steady. "Excuse me, sir. I need help. My family is missing." He didn't answer right away. He tucked the camera into his bag and stood slowly, sizing me up like he couldn't decide if I was real or some nuisance he didn't have time for. After a few seconds, he said, "You shouldn't be out here alone." His voice was flat but not unkind. I felt tears burning in my eyes because it was the first time in over a day that anyone had spoken to me. "I don't have a choice," I said. "They left me. My husband, my daughter, my granddaughter. They're all gone." He glanced over my shoulder like he expected someone to be with me, then looked back at me and sighed. "I'm Jake," he said. "I'm a photographer. I know this area. You need food, water?" My heart lifted a little. "Please, anything. I've been walking for hours." He nodded and unzipped his bag, pulling out a bottle of water and a small pack of jerky. My hands shook as I took them, and I tried not to cry while I ate. Jake watched me, his face hard to read. When I finished, he said, "You can come with me. I have a camp about an hour that way." I wanted to believe he was safe, that he'd help me find my family, but something about the way he kept glancing at the trail behind me made my stomach clench. I thought about the whisper I'd heard, about the deliberate clues, and wondered if he knew more than he was saying. Still, I couldn't stay out here with no supplies, so I nodded. "All right," I said. "I'll come." He didn't smile, he just turned and started walking, and I followed, hugging Maya's backpack to my chest. As we walked, he asked questions. When I'd last seen them, where we'd camped, whether they'd left any kind of message. I told him everything, watching his face for any flicker that he recognized something. He didn't react, but when I mentioned the note that said "keep walking," he paused mid-step and looked at me. "They wrote that?" he asked, like it meant more to him than he let on. "Yes," I said. "My daughter's handwriting." He didn't respond. I just started walking again, faster this time. I had to work to keep up, and every time I slowed, he glanced back impatiently. After a while, we reached a narrow clearing where a tarp had been strung between trees, and a small metal stove sat on a square of plywood. It looked lived in. Jake gestured for me to sit, then went to his pack and started unpacking more supplies. I watched him carefully, noticing the way he checked the perimeter before he settled. He handed me another bottle of water, and I drank it slowly, trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to trust him, to believe I'd finally found someone who could help me get out of this nightmare. But the way he kept scanning the trees made me wonder if he was expecting someone, or hiding from them. After a few minutes, he said, "I don't know how to tell you this, but people disappear in these woods more often than you'd think." His voice was low, serious. "Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't." My skin prickled. "What are you saying?" He shook his head. "I'm saying you need to be careful who you trust." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but before I could, he turned away and started organizing his camera gear again. My heart thudded with unease. I knew I couldn't stay here forever, but I also knew I didn't have the strength to keep walking right now. I told myself I'd rest a little, then figure out my next move. Jake didn't offer any more conversation. He just kept working silently, and I tried not to think about how alone I really was, even with someone else nearby. When the sun started to dip lower, I had no way to tell the time. Jake finally spoke again. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we'll see if we can find them." I wanted to ask if he was going to stay up, if he'd keep watch, but something in his expression made me swallow the question. I curled up on a thin mat he laid out for me, clutching the backpack, and tried to pretend this was temporary, that I'd wake up to find it was all some terrible misunderstanding. My last thought before I drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep was that I didn't know if I'd ever see my family again, or if I even wanted to after what they'd done. When I woke, hours later, my mouth tasted stale, and for a moment, I didn't remember where I was. Then I looked around and realized Jake was gone, his tarp flapping slightly where he tied it, his bag missing. My heart slammed into my ribs, and I scrambled to my feet, dizzy with panic. That's when I noticed the footprints in the dirt, leading away from camp, fresh enough that I could see the tread marks. My hands shook as I picked up Maya's backpack and followed them, because I didn't have any other choice but to keep moving, no matter how much I wanted to collapse. I didn't waste any time standing around once I saw Jake's footprints, because the second I realized he'd left without waking me, something in my chest dropped like a stone, and I knew I couldn't sit there hoping he'd come back. I grabbed Maya's backpack, stuffed the half-empty water bottle inside, and forced myself to start moving, following the fresh prints because they were the only sign of another living person. And part of me believed he might lead me somewhere that made sense. My legs were so stiff I almost fell twice, but I kept my eyes on the ground, tracking every indent and scuff in the dirt. My mind wouldn't stop replaying everything Jake had said, especially the way he looked at me when I mentioned the note. It was like he knew exactly what it meant, but wouldn't admit it. I felt sick, thinking maybe he'd been part of whatever this was all along. As I walked, I kept remembering small things that felt different now, like Frank telling me to pack extra clothes I never found later, or Lisa asking if I'd updated my will, saying it was just in case, and how I'd laughed it off. I didn't know what was real anymore. After what felt like an hour, the trail dipped into a shallow hollow, and I stopped when I saw something that made my throat close. In the middle of a flattened patch of grass was Lisa's hiking boot, lying on its side, the laces tangled like she'd pulled it off in a hurry or someone else had done it for her. My first impulse was to run to it, but I forced myself to look around carefully first, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. When I was sure I was alone, I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. The sole was clean except for a smear of something dark near the heel. My mind kept trying to decide if it was mud or blood, and the uncertainty made my stomach twist. I tucked the boot under my arm and kept going because no matter what, I had to know if she was out here somewhere. Not long after, I spotted a narrow side trail splitting off to the left, and the footprints veered that way. I followed them, my heart hammering so loud I could barely hear anything else. About 20 yards in, I stumbled on a low wooden sign, half buried in leaves. Someone had scratched off most of the letters, but I could still make out part of the word station. I felt a flicker of hope that maybe there was help nearby, so I pressed on, every step feeling heavier. The trail curved, and I stopped dead when I saw a small wooden structure ahead. A ranger station, with faded paint and a lopsided porch. I nearly cried with relief. I hurried up the steps and tried the door, but it was locked. I banged on it with the side of my fist, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone inside?" For a minute there was nothing, and I thought maybe the place had been abandoned for years. Then a latch scraped, and the door cracked open just enough for a man to peer out. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with sandy hair and a tired face. His eyes moved from my face to the boot under my arm, then to Maya's backpack. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cautious. "I'm Evelyn Carter," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "My family is missing. I've been out here 2 days. I found this boot. Please, can you help me?" He hesitated, like he was weighing whether I was telling the truth. Finally, he opened the door wider. "Come inside." I stepped past him into the cramped station, which smelled faintly of old coffee. He gestured to a chair. Sit down. My name's Cole. Ranger Cole. I sank into the chair, feeling my body sag with exhaustion. He pulled a metal thermos from a shelf and poured water into a paper cup, handing it to me. I drank half in one swallow, trying not to break down. Can you call someone? I asked. I don't know where they went. I think someone's been leaving things for me to find. It doesn't feel like an accident. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, studying me with an expression I couldn't read. You said your family disappeared. Yes, I said. Frank Carter, my husband, Lisa, my daughter, and my granddaughter Maya. He nodded slowly and reached for a clipboard on the desk. I'll need you to describe them. Full names, ages, anything you remember about the last time you saw them. My hands were trembling as I listed every detail. Frank's height, Lisa's hair color, the way Maya wouldn't go anywhere without her doll. When I finished, he flipped through a folder that looked like some kind of incident log. And something in his face shifted, like he'd seen something he wasn't expecting. I'm going to be honest with you, he said finally. This area has a history. Families have gone missing out here before. My stomach dropped. What are you talking about? He turned the folder so I could see a grainy photocopy of a photograph. My breath caught when I recognized Lisa in it, standing near a crooked fence, one hand resting on a dog's head. She looked tired, but she was alive. The photo looked recent, but I had no idea where it had been taken. Where did you get this? I demanded. He hesitated. This came in through a tip line about a week ago. No return address. It was marked confidential. My hands went cold. That's my daughter. Why didn't anyone tell me? He looked away. Because your name and your husband's were redacted in the incident file. I don't know why. I stared at him, feeling a sick wave of dread. You mean someone deliberately erased our names? It looks that way, he said. My mind was spinning. I thought of all the times Frank took calls he wouldn't explain, the way Lisa avoided my questions, how none of them seemed surprised when I suggested this camping trip. Like they'd already decided what was going to happen. I swallowed hard. I found a note that said, "Keep walking." I think they want me to go somewhere, he frowned, then moved to a cabinet near the window. He rummaged for a moment and pulled out a map, spreading it on the desk. There's an old property line here, he said, tracing a finger along a faded boundary. Some locals think a group squats out here, calling themselves the Resurgence. Mostly survivalist types. I don't have proof, but there've been rumors about them coercing families into disappearing. My mouth felt dry again. Why my family? I don't know, he said quietly. But if they're involved, you need to be careful. My hands were slick with sweat. I can't leave without finding them. He met my eyes. I won't make you leave. But you shouldn't do this alone. I gripped the edge of the desk. I don't trust anyone anymore. He looked pained but didn't argue. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he pushed the map closer to me. If you want to keep going, there's an old trailhead here. Some of the abandoned structures are marked. You might find something. I folded the map carefully, tucked it into Maya's backpack, and stood. Thank you, I said, my voice hoarse. He looked like he wanted to stop me, but he just nodded. Before I left, I asked, why was Lisa with the dog in that picture? He hesitated. The note that came with it said, she knows. That's all. My stomach lurched, but I couldn't ask any more questions. I walked out the door, gripping the boot and the map, and started toward the trailhead he'd shown me. Every step felt harder than the last, but I kept thinking about Lisa's tired face in that photo, the way her hand rested on the dog's head like she was trying to comfort herself. Part of me still wanted to believe they'd been forced to leave me, but the other part knew too much of this felt planned. I didn't know which truth would hurt more. I only knew I was going to keep going until I had an answer. I didn't waste time standing outside the ranger station after Cole shut the door behind me, because the longer I stayed still, the more my thoughts started to spiral into places I wasn't ready to go. So I gripped the map in one hand and Lisa's boot in the other and walked straight back to the trail, forcing my legs to keep moving even though every muscle in my body wanted to sit down and give up. The trailhead Cole marked was about a mile from the station, and I counted each step like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. Every so often, I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see Jake or some stranger watching, but there was nothing except the same empty path. As I walked, I kept thinking about that picture of Lisa with the dog and the words, "She knows," scrawled on the back. I replayed every conversation we'd had in the last few months, trying to figure out what she could have known that was worth erasing our names from an official record or driving us all out here to vanish. My mind kept snagging on the night she called me crying, saying she couldn't do it anymore, and when I asked what she meant, she hung up. At the time, I thought she was just tired, overwhelmed with work and Maya and Frank's constant interference. But now, I wondered if she'd been trying to confess something bigger. My throat felt tight, and I blinked hard to keep my vision clear. When I reached the fork, where the old property line started, I stopped to study the map, tracing my finger along the faded contour lines Cole had shown me. There was a marker near a shallow dip labeled Utility Access, and next to it, in lighter pencil, a note that said, Underground Entrance. Unconfirmed. Something about that made my stomach twist, but it also felt like the only lead I had. I folded the map and tucked it back into Maya's backpack, then gripped the straps and started down the left fork. The trail narrowed to the point I had to turn sideways in some spots, and I kept brushing against low branches that snagged my clothes. The skin on my arms was raw where the twigs had scratched me, but I didn't care. My whole body felt like it was running on something more desperate than adrenaline. After about 40 minutes of picking my way over uneven ground, I spotted what looked like a collapsed shed just off the trail. The roof was caved in, but the walls were still mostly standing. My heart kicked up because if anyone had been squatting out here, this was exactly the kind of place they'd use. I forced myself to walk closer, scanning the ground for fresh tracks. There were boot prints near the door. Different from Jake's, bigger. And they looked recent. My pulse hammered so hard I felt lightheaded. I stepped carefully over the threshold, my hands shaking, and looked inside. At first, it just looked abandoned. Broken crates, a rusted lantern. But when my eyes adjusted, I saw the floor in the corner had been cleared of debris, and there was a rectangle of plywood that didn't match the rest of the boards. My breath caught. I crouched and touched the edge, and it lifted up with surprising ease, revealing a square opening just big enough for a person to climb through. The smell that drifted out was stale, like old paper and something metallic. My mind screamed to walk away, but my body moved on its own. I set Lisa's boot aside and lowered myself into the hole, my hands gripping the rough edge so tight I felt splinters drive into my palms. The drop was only a few feet, and when my shoes hit solid ground, I froze, listening. Nothing moved. I fumbled for the small flashlight I'd found in the ranger station's entryway, a last-minute impulse I was now grateful for, and clicked it on. The beam cut across the space and I saw the walls were lined with nailed-up boards covered in yellowed newspaper clippings and Polaroid photos. I stepped closer, shining the light across the rows of images, and my breath caught in my throat. Every photo was of a family. Sometimes smiling, sometimes caught mid-motion, but all of them looked like they'd been taken without the subjects knowing. I forced myself to look carefully, telling myself there was no point in denial anymore. Near the center, about eye level, was a photo that made my knees almost give out. It was me, sitting on the back porch of my house, folding laundry. I remembered that day. I'd been talking to Frank about taking Maya to the aquarium, and Lisa had been upstairs. Someone had been close enough to take this picture, and none of us noticed. My stomach lurched. I moved the beam lower and saw another photo, this one of Frank in the driveway, staring at his phone. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight. I knew, without any more evidence, that this wasn't just some squatter's hideout. Somebody had been watching us for a long time. I turned in a slow circle, taking in every inch of the room. In the far corner, A wooden crate held a stack of binders, each labeled with names and dates. I pulled the top one out and flipped it open, scanning the entries. Some were just lists of times and locations, but others included notes I didn't understand. Phrases like conditioned compliance, secured, and primary subject, unaware. I read those words over and over, my mind trying to reject them, but deep down I knew exactly what they meant. Frank had known. Lisa had known. That's why they were so tense, why they looked at me like they were waiting for something to happen. My hands started to shake harder, and I closed the binder before I could read any more. My throat felt raw, and I realized I was making a sound, a hoarse half-cry I couldn't stop. I forced myself to breathe, to stand up straight, because falling apart in this place wasn't an option. I picked up the flashlight and turned toward the narrow passageway that led deeper into the bunker. My gut told me I shouldn't go any farther alone, but I also knew there was no way I could turn back now. I followed the passage slowly, my hand brushing the wall for balance. The floor sloped downward, and after a few steps, I noticed the boards under my feet were newer, like someone had been reinforcing them. I kept going until I reached another room. Smaller than the first, with a low table against the far wall. On it was an old voice recorder, the kind Frank used to carry when he traveled for work. My heart thudded as I reached for it, my fingers clumsy. When I pressed play, static crackled. Then his voice came through, low and strained. "If you're hearing this, it means you didn't do what they asked. Evelyn, I'm sorry." My breath caught, and I pressed the recorder closer to my ear. "I thought I could protect you, but they made it clear. If you didn't disappear, they'd take Maya. They have leverage. I can't say more. Just know I tried." The recording clicked off, leaving an empty silence that felt like it was crushing me from the inside. My knees buckled, and I had to brace myself against the table to keep from collapsing. My husband had known. He'd helped them. My mind kept replaying his words, the way he said he tried, like that was supposed to make any of this forgivable. I didn't know how long I stood there, breathing hard, trying to keep from screaming. Eventually, I forced myself upright. I tucked the recorder into Maya's backpack and turned to leave, but just as I reached the threshold, my flashlight flickered. I smacked it with the heel of my palm, and it came back on, but not before I saw movement at the end of the passageway. A shape, human-sized, shifting in the dark. My heart stuttered, and, for a second, I couldn't move. Then the flashlight steadied, and the passage was empty again. My chest heaved. I didn't know if I'd imagined it, or if someone was really there. But either way, I couldn't stay another minute. I scrambled back up the passage, hands slipping on the boards, and hauled myself out of the hatch, grabbing Lisa's boot before I slammed the plywood closed. I staggered away from the shed, breathing hard, and didn't stop until the bunker was hidden behind a wall of brush. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely hold the backpack. I didn't know who I could trust anymore. All I knew was that if Frank's recording was true, then Lisa was out here because she believed it was the only way to save her daughter. And if that was true, then Maya was still alive somewhere. That was the only thought that kept me moving as I started back toward the trail, determined to find my granddaughter and drag the truth into the light, no matter what it cost me. I didn't let myself stop for more than a few seconds after I left the bunker behind, because I knew that if I let my body rest, my mind would start unraveling in a way I wasn't sure I'd come back from. So I tightened my grip on Maya's backpack and forced my legs to keep going, even though my muscles were screaming with exhaustion. My thoughts kept looping over the recording of Frank's voice saying he was sorry and that he tried, as if that would somehow make it easier to accept that he'd known about this, that he'd been part of something that ended with me alone out here hunting for the scraps of my family. I kept replaying the words, "If you didn't disappear, they'd take Maya," and every time I thought about what that meant, I felt like I might throw up. It was one thing to believe Frank and Lisa had abandoned me because they were tired of me or angry about something I'd done, but it was another to realize they'd been forced into it by people who apparently had the power to make good on their threats. That thought was the only reason I didn't let hatred swallow me whole, because if Maya's life was in danger, there was no part of me that wouldn't do exactly what they'd done if it meant she'd stay alive. But that didn't mean I could forgive it, Not yet. Not when I was still stumbling through this alone. The trail sloped upward and curved, and for a moment I lost track of the footprints I'd been following, but then I spotted them again, near a stump. Deep boot treads that didn't match my own. I was starting to suspect they belonged to Jake, that he'd gone ahead to wherever this led, and part of me burned with resentment that he'd left without a word. But a smaller part of me wondered if he'd been trying to draw whoever was watching away from me. I didn't know which version I believed, and I didn't have time to decide. I pressed on, my throat tight and dry, until I saw something ahead that made me stop short. The trail widened into a clearing, and in the middle of it stood Frank. He was leaning against a splintered fence post, arms folded, looking at the ground like he was trying to figure out what he'd say when I reached him. My whole body felt like it had gone cold, but I kept walking until there was no more space between us, and when he finally lifted his head, I saw in his face that he was afraid of me. That was almost worse than all the lies. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and hoarse. But I held up my hand because I didn't trust what might come out of my mouth if I let him finish that thought. For a second, neither of us spoke. He swallowed hard and looked away. "I didn't want it to happen like this," he said, but the words sounded hollow. I clenched my jaw. "You left me with nothing. No water, no way to call for help. You planned it." He winced, like he couldn't stand hearing it out loud. "I planned to keep you safe," he said quietly. "We had no choice. They said if we didn't do it, they'd hurt Maya. They showed us pictures of what they did to people who didn't cooperate." My chest felt too tight to breathe. "You could have told me. We could have found another way." He shook his head. "They were listening, watching. Even if I tried to tell you, it would have been worse. Lisa wanted to run. I stopped her because I thought, at least this way you'd have a chance to survive." I felt something hot and bitter rise in my throat. "So you decided for me. You decided I'd wake up alone." He didn't deny it. His shoulders slumped, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years in the 2 days I hadn't seen him. "Where is Lisa?" I demanded. "Where is Maya?" He lifted his hand and pointed to the far edge of the clearing where a narrow footpath disappeared between the trees. "They took Lisa farther in. Maya is with them, but they said they wouldn't hurt her if we cooperated." My stomach lurched. "You believe them?" He closed his eyes. "I don't know what to believe anymore." My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the strap of Maya's backpack to steady them. "Are you going to try to stop me?" I asked, my voice flat. His eyes opened, and he looked at me like he didn't recognize me. "No," he said finally. "I'm going to help you. I can't keep pretending any of this is okay." He stepped closer, slowly, like he was afraid I'd bolt. "There's a bunker ahead. That's where they're keeping the families they think will give them leverage. Lisa's there. Maya's probably nearby." My pulse kicked up. "And you know how to get inside?" He nodded. "I know the codes. They made me memorize them. But Evelyn," his voice cracked, "if we do this, there's no going back. They'll come after us." My chest felt like it was caving in. "I don't care," I said, and I meant it. He stared at me for a long moment, and then something shifted in his face, like the last shred of whatever he'd been holding on to had snapped. He turned and started down the narrow path, and I followed, my legs trembling. We walked in silence for what felt like forever, until the trail ended at a low concrete doorway half hidden by brush. Frank crouched near the keypad mounted beside the door and entered a long string of numbers, his hand steady even though I could see sweat on his neck. The lock clicked open, and he pulled the door wide. Inside was a narrow hall lit by a single bulb overhead, and every instinct I had told me to turn around and run, but I forced myself to step inside because this was the only way to get Maya back. Frank closed the door behind us, and the sound echoed through the hall. "This way," he said, his voice rough. We moved down the hall, our footsteps sounding too loud, and when we reached a corner, I stopped him with a hand on his arm. "If this is a trap, I swear to God." He looked me straight in the eye. "It's not. I want her safe as much as you do." He turned and led me deeper, and when we came to a metal door, he pressed his ear to it, listening. I heard muffled voices on the other side, one low and calm, the other high-pitched and shaking. I knew in my bones that it was Lisa. My throat closed. Frank reached for the handle, but I grabbed his wrist. "We do this together," I whispered. He nodded, and we both shoved the door open at the same time. Inside, Lisa was sitting on a crate, her hands tied in front of her, her face streaked with tears. She looked up, and when she saw me, she let out a sob. "Mom," she whispered. My heart cracked wide open, but I forced myself to stay focused. Standing behind her was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a blank expression, like he'd been waiting for us. He lifted his hand slowly, showing us he wasn't holding a weapon, but I didn't trust the calm in his face. "You weren't supposed to come here," he said quietly. I stepped in front of Frank, my voice shaking. "Where is my granddaughter?" The man tilted his head toward a door behind him. "She's safe, for now." My blood turned to ice. "Let her go." He didn't move. "This wasn't about you, Mrs. Carter. It was about making sure certain people paid their debts. Your husband was one of them." I turned to Frank, who looked like he was about to collapse. "What is he talking about?" Frank's voice came out in a whisper. "I owed them money. A lot of money. I thought I could pay it back before they did anything, but they decided Lisa and Maya were leverage. They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd make sure you disappeared permanently." My vision went red. "So you let them use our family as collateral?" He nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I'm sorry," he choked out. The man behind Lisa shifted, and I felt something snap inside me. I moved fast, grabbing the metal pole leaning against the wall and swinging it at his knee. He went down with a grunt, and Frank lunged forward to untie Lisa's hands. She clung to him, sobbing, while I turned the handle on the door he'd indicated. When it swung open, I saw Maya sitting on a cot, clutching her doll. Her eyes widened, and she scrambled into my arms. My heart cracked open and reformed all at once as I hugged her to my chest. Behind me, Lisa was crying so hard she couldn't stand. I turned to Frank, my voice steady for the first time in days. "We're leaving. All of us?" The man on the floor groaned, but he didn't try to stop us. I herded Lisa and Maya through the hall, Frank behind us, and when we stepped out into the clearing again, I felt something break free inside me. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing. Whatever part of me had been waiting for someone else to save me was gone for good. The moment we stepped out of that bunker and felt solid ground under our feet again, something shifted in me that I can't fully explain. Like the part of my mind that had been frozen with fear and disbelief finally started working again. And all I could think about was getting Maya and Lisa as far from that place as possible before the man inside decided to come after us, or someone else showed up to finish what he started. I held Maya tight against my side, her small arms wrapped around my waist, and when I looked down and saw the way she was squeezing her doll so hard her knuckles were white, I felt a fresh wave of fury that any of them had ever dared to lay a hand on her or use her as a bargaining chip. Frank kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected to see someone emerging from the trees, but I didn't waste time worrying about who might be watching. I had wasted enough energy doubting my instincts, and now every part of me was focused on one thing: getting my family out alive. Lisa stumbled more than once as we started back toward the main trail, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stay upright. And finally, I stopped and took her by the shoulder. "You have to stay with me," I told her, in a voice that didn't sound like my own, and she nodded, her face streaked with tears and grime. I didn't know how long it would take before those men regrouped, but I wasn't going to stand around and find out. We moved fast, following the path Frank said would lead us to a service road about 2 miles north. And the whole time, I kept one hand on Maya and the other gripping the strap of her backpack like it was the only thing anchoring me to the ground. Nobody spoke. I think we were all afraid that if we did, the fragile thread holding us together would snap. When the trees finally thinned and I saw the ragged edge of asphalt in the distance, my legs almost gave out. I swallowed the sob that tried to rise and tightened my grip on Maya's shoulder. "Almost there," I whispered, more to myself than to her. Frank moved ahead to scan the road, and when he turned back to wave us forward, I felt the smallest flicker of relief. We stepped onto the cracked pavement, and for a moment the silence felt enormous. I glanced left and right, half expecting headlights or voices, but There was nothing. We follow this, Frank said quietly, his voice hoarse. It should lead us to the ranger station, if we keep north. I didn't reply. I just started walking, Maya at my side and Lisa behind me. Every few minutes I turned to check on her, because I could see she was on the edge of collapse. But she kept moving, her gaze locked on Maya like she was afraid to look anywhere else. The farther we got from that bunker, the more my thoughts started to clear, and all the things I hadn't let myself process came crashing in at once. I thought about the recording of Frank's voice saying he'd tried, about the way he'd stood in that clearing, waiting for me to find him, about how he'd pointed to the bunker like he was finally ready to stop hiding. And I thought about Lisa's face when she looked up and saw me in that room. The way she said, "Mom," so like she didn't believe I was really there. My chest ached with a grief I didn't have words for. None of this would ever be the same. We walked for what felt like hours until the ranger station finally came into view around a bend. And when I saw the dull glint of the sign out front, I felt something give in my knees. Frank caught my arm before I could collapse, and I didn't have the strength to push him away. Cole came out onto the porch the second he saw us, his eyes wide as he took in the four of us together. He didn't ask any questions. He just opened the door and stepped aside. We went inside and I guided Maya to a chair, crouching in front of her so I could look her in the eyes. "You're safe," I told her. "You hear me? You're safe." She nodded, her lower lip trembling, and she reached up to touch my face. I had to swallow hard to keep from crying. Cole handed us water and started calling for backup, explaining in a low voice that he'd need statements and that help was on the way. I barely listened. My eyes stayed on Maya, and every time she blinked, I had to remind myself this was real and not another cruel trick. After a few minutes, Frank moved to stand near the window, his shoulders slumped. And Lisa sat on the floor with her back against the wall, her hands covering her face. I could hear her breathing in ragged gasps, but she didn't say anything. I knew that whatever happened next, nothing would erase the damage that had been done. But I also knew I was the only one who could decide what came after this. When Cole finished the call, he looked at me carefully. "They'll be here soon. An ambulance, law enforcement. You'll be safe here until then." I nodded, but part of me already knew I wasn't going to wait for someone else to decide how this ended. I stood slowly, feeling every bruise and scrape, and I looked at Frank. He met my gaze, and for a second, we just stared at each other. Then I spoke in a voice so calm it didn't feel like it belonged to me. "When this is over, you're leaving my house, both of you." Lisa's head jerked up, her eyes wide and red. "Mom," she started, but I held up a hand. "I don't care what your reasons were. You chose to let them leave me out there alone. You chose to lie, and I won't spend another day under the same roof pretending that's something I can forgive." Frank swallowed hard. "Where will we go?" I shook my head. "That's not my problem anymore." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Lisa broke down crying, her shoulders shaking so violently she could barely draw a breath. I turned away because I couldn't stand to watch her unravel. Maya reached for my hand and I squeezed it, grounding myself in the one thing I was sure of. She was still here. That was enough. When the sirens finally approached in the distance, I felt a numb sort of relief that it was finally ending. Officers came through the door asking questions. EMTs started checking Maya and Lisa for injuries, and everything blurred into a series of motions I followed without really thinking. When one of the deputies asked if I needed medical attention, I shook my head. "I just need to go home," I said quietly. After what felt like forever, they gave us clearance to leave. Cole pulled me aside as we stepped onto the porch. "I'm sorry for everything you've been through," he said. I nodded because I didn't have words for any of it. We walked out to one of the cruisers, and when they offered to drive us, I hesitated. Then I turned to Lisa, who was holding Maya's hand like it was the only thing keeping her tethered. "You can ride with them," I said. "When you get back, I want you to start packing." She opened her mouth to argue, but the look on my face must have told her better. She closed her eyes and nodded. Frank didn't say a word. He just walked to the second vehicle, climbing in like he already knew this was the last ride we'd ever take together. I waited until they were gone before I let myself exhale. When the deputy offered to help me into the front seat, I shook my head. "I'm fine," I said. I've been doing just fine on my own. The ride home was quiet. Every bump in the road felt like it was shaking loose another piece of the woman I'd been before this trip. But I didn't feel grief anymore. I felt something that almost bordered on relief. When we pulled up in front of my house, I stepped out without waiting for help, carrying Maya's backpack and my own bag like I didn't need anyone to take them from me. I unlocked the door and walked inside, and the first thing I did was go straight to the living room window and pull the curtains wide open. No more hiding. No more pretending. Just me and the truth. I set the bags down and turned to Maya, who was standing in the doorway watching me carefully. "Come here," I said, my voice steady. She walked over, and I pulled her into my arms. "We're going to be okay," I whispered into her hair, and for the first time in days, I believed it.